Once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away, a beautiful princess named Snow White lived with her stepmother, the queen. Snow White's mother had died when she was very young, and her father had remarried. Sadly, her father also passed away, leaving Snow White alone with her stepmother. The queen was very vain and had a magical mirror that she consulted every day. The question to ask is, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" she would ask. And the mirror always replied, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." This pleased the queen greatly, for she was very proud of her beauty. As Snow White grew older, she became more and more beautiful, and one day, when the queen asked her mirror the usual question, it replied, "Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen was furious and consumed by jealousy. She decided that Snow White must be eliminated. The queen ordered a huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. She gave him strict instructions to bring back Snow White's heart as proof. However, when the huntsman and Snow White reached the forest, he couldn't bear to harm her. "Run away, Snow White," he said. "Run far away and never come back." He let her go and, in his place, brought back a heart of a wild animal to the queen. Snow White ran through the forest, frightened and alone. As night fell, she stumbled upon a tiny cottage. Exhausted, she knocked on the door, but no one answered. She entered and found the place very small but tidy. There were 7 little beds, 7 little chairs, and 7 little plates. Tired from her journey, Snow White lay down on one of the beds and fell asleep. The cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs who worked in a nearby mine. When they came home and found Snow White, they were astonished. But her beauty and innocence won their hearts, and they decided to let her stay. Snow White lived happily with the dwarfs, keeping their home neat and cooking delicious meals for them. They warned her to be cautious and never open the door to strangers, as they knew the queen might be looking for her. Meanwhile, the queen discovered that Snow White was still alive when she asked her mirror once again. Furious, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She disguised herself as an old peddler woman and created a poisoned apple. One bite, and Snow White would fall into a deep, death-like sleep. One day, while the dwarfs were away, the disguised queen knocked on the cottage door. "Would you like to buy an apple, dearie?" she asked. Snow White hesitated but eventually took the apple. As soon as she took a bite, she fell to the ground, unconscious. The queen cackled with glee, thinking she had finally rid herself of Snow White, and hurried back to her castle. When the dwarfs returned home and found Snow White lying lifeless on the floor, they were devastated. They could not bring themselves to bury her, so they made a glass coffin and placed her inside, keeping vigil by her side. Time passed, and one day, a prince who had heard tales of Snow White's beauty came to the forest. When he saw her in the glass coffin, he was overcome by her beauty and sorrow. He leaned down and kissed her gently. At that moment, the spell was broken, and Snow White awoke. The prince and Snow White fell deeply in love. The dwarfs were overjoyed and gave their blessing. The prince took Snow White to his castle, where they were married in a grand celebration. The wicked queen, upon learning this, was so enraged that she shattered her magical mirror and disappeared, never to be seen again. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after, surrounded by their friends, the 7 dwarfs, who visited them often and shared in their joy and happiness. And so, they all lived happily ever after.